Growing up in church can be complicated. For some people, church provides a safe community where they can grow, socialize, and find a personal relationship with God that lasts throughout the rest of their lives. For others, growing up in church can be an incredibly traumatic experience that they spend years trying to recover from. There are about as many individual experiences in church as there are people. But over the past decades, the church's struggle to keep young people engaged has grown from a concerning topic of conversation to a full-blown crisis. To put it more plainly, young people today are having a far harder time connecting with organized religion than the generations before them. A lot of time and money has been invested in studying this separation. And people who study it have recommended all sorts of solutions, from changing the style of the worship music to pushing more Bible studies in church services. One article, published in 2022, suggested that there's a direct link between how often families have worship at home together and how likely their children will be to stay involved in church long term. I remember reading that article and thinking, this doesn't really reflect my experience at all. For most of the people that I grew up with, their reasons for disconnecting had a lot more to do with what they found in church, in Christian schools, and in their home lives than anything else. Their unanswered questions and disappointments in Christian culture remain topics of conversation even when we talk to each other today. Is the answer more family worships, more chapel services, and more prayer meetings? Or is it something else? For this episode, I decided to ask one of my high school classmates about her experience. My friend Krystal grew up heavily involved in church. She was the kid you'd see doing special music and staying late with her family on Saturday afternoons for more worship services. She joined Christian clubs and memorized Bible verses in church and attended the same Seventh-day Adventist high school that I did. Although our paths have taken some different directions since we graduated together, Krystal remains a close friend of mine and someone I greatly respect. And I think a lot of her story can challenge the conversations that we have around young people, church, and the walls we've built between them. I'm your host, Caleb Isley, and this is Bridges Over Walls. One of the things that blew my mind when my wife and I started dating was just like, in Spanish-speaking churches, man, you guys spend a lot of time together. Like, you're in each other's houses multiple times a week. I had seen church more as like the place you go to listen to the sermon, or if there's a special event, but not really a community space. It's a program space.
With Hispanics versus the American churches, we spend all day in church. 9 a.m. to, 1 p.m. church is over. You go home, you eat Sabbath lunch, and then you get right back to church at 5 p.m. And we all end it together at sundown singing a nice little song. So growing up, the church was a huge part of my life. It was basically the social center of my family's life. Not to brag, but my family was one of the first Hispanic families in Indiana that kind of started the Hispanic churches over there. So everybody I knew was in the church. I don't think I ever really made a friend that wasn't in the church in some way until probably college.
Wow.
If that. But I think that the downfall with Spanish churches and the fact that they're so close-knit is it kind of breeds judgment in a way, because since everybody knows everybody, it's easier for someone to come up to you and be like, why are you dressed like that? Why did you get your ears pierced? It almost becomes more legalistic in a sense. I remember thinking growing up that it would be, the highest crime to show up to church wearing pants. Just things like that. And it's part of it is cultural, because the Hispanic culture in general is, very close knit. Everybody knows everybody. Everybody has similarities. So then the person that stands out, then they stand out. And everybody's going to point out how they stand out. And that kind of makes it difficult when, for someone like me, I have very short pixie hair. I have multiple piercings. I have some visible tattoos. Now, even if I just walk into the church where I was raised in, I feel that I am the odd one out.
This isn't just like a faith thing, but it's also a culture, right? Like it's your whole life. It's everybody that you know. It's the pattern of life for Seventh-day Adventists. If you haven't interacted with us before, Friday night, suddenly this thing happens in Adventist households where they're like suddenly change their pattern, right? Like everybody's preparing for something. And so there's just this whole pattern of life that happens growing up Seventh-day Adventist. But when you think back to like, was this just kind of the way everybody around you was doing things? Did you have any kind of like personal buy-in on the spiritual side of it?
Since I was raised in it, it was always just something that like, okay, this is just how life is. I didn't really question it for a long time. But now looking back, I don't know that I ever got to a point where I took on religion as something that I felt was me. Maybe until high school. Because I grew up with a lot of the same group of kids. So we all went to the same church together. They're all Dominican, so our families knew each other. So some of the older kids were kind of questioning, but my impression as the younger one, it just kind of felt like, oh, they're just teenage rebellion, you know? So it wasn't really something that I took seriously at the time. But now looking back, there are definitely a couple people where I kind of recognize thoughts that I ended up having later on in what they were saying back then.
Yeah. It's interesting that you point out the kind of teenage rebellion idea because there's something happening in Christianity right now where for a long time it was assumed that kind of once our generation had kids, we would do what each generation before. There was kind of this lull where people would participate less in college and that kind of thing. But when you have kids, you come back, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not what's happening for our generation because partially we're not having kids at nearly the same rate. But also, I think there's just more to it than that. So if you go around to churches that used to have several hundred members when we were kids, very few of them still do.
Mm-hmm.
Since the purpose of this show is kind of writing the next stories differently, what's something that people who are still committed to church can think about as they're relating to their own kids and their own high school students?
Yeah, I often think back on high school and kind of wish that I had the same mentality then that I do now, because not necessarily in what I believe in, but in being able to question things. In high school, there were certain things, certain rules that they would put on the girls there that I remember back then thinking, this is weird and I don't like it, but I couldn't really articulate why. And I didn't know how to express why, other than in a way of sounding like, oh, I'm just a teenager complaining that I can't wear what I want to wear. When in reality, it kind of went much deeper than that, and it's still something I think about 10 years later. Even putting religion aside, that time is definitely a time of figuring out what you want and what's going on with the world and who you are. So I feel like adding religion into that is just part of that whole process of getting older and learning about yourself. I understand that there needs to be certain rules, but I feel like there's not enough communication with why certain things are in place, and that just kind of fosters the teenage rebellion. I feel like there is a line. I know it's a hard line, but there is a line between making rules to protect your students versus making rules because somebody said so. It's kind of similar to, I know like growing up, I wasn't allowed to go to the movie theater and I never understood why. And I would ask my parents why, like, what's wrong with the movie theater? Why can't I go? And the answer was never a real answer. It was just, oh, that's just how we do things, or that's what pastor said, or something about Ellen White. But then I would keep asking, okay, but what's wrong with it? But why do we have to follow this? And it was never a real answer. Things like that. People should be allowed to question, and people should have real answers.
Man, high school, like I took it very serious. And so I'm remembering this one particular instance where I feel very convicted that the music I'm listening to and the books I'm reading and the movies I'm watching are endangering my soul. And so I go home and I take all my CDs of like classic rock and DVDs and everything, but like Shrek, I think I kept Shrek, but all these other things. And I take them and I physically go get a trash bag. I take them into my backyard and I make sure I break everything so I'll never have it again. I rip up the books. Like it's just this very dramatic, like, oh my gosh, God, I'm so sorry that I've been like involved in these horrible things, and I really wasn't a rebellious kid, but to me, the way it was framed was that these things are awful and they're like a mortal danger to your soul. I really lived in that space for the next several years religiously as far as how I thought of myself. I think I was maybe a little judgmental of people, but mostly I was judgmental of myself, where it was just like all these things are bad and you have to eventually stop every single aspect of your life, but like reading the Bible and going to church.
The first time in high school that I kind of started to maybe investigate it more for myself was probably my sophomore year. There was a student that had some kind of possession event. That's kind of what the staff and the adults were referring to it as. And I was really close friends with her at the time. So I remember being outside of the door with a bunch of pastors, and I think that was the first time that I really felt that it wasn't just routine, like something might be going on here for real and something I need to pay attention to. I remember going home after that and I just started reading the Bible a ton. And I remember because my parents were like, "Oh wow, she's reading the Bible. What is happening here?" Because I've always been a really big reader, but I was never reading religious books. I was just reading, fiction, Nancy Drew, things like that. But as time went on, it just kind of faded and I never really followed through with it. And it just kind of stayed routine. I feel like part of it is going to all these Adventist institutions. Even in college, you have to have a certain amount of worship credits. So I just never got out of this is just a routine of my life.
Yeah, definitely. And so we're coming up to a major traumatic event in your life. I remember your mom being really involved at school, and she passes away, and you are now in this church that is the same one that your family helped start, right? It's like so ingrained in your life. Was the church a help to you in that moment, or was it more of a net negative?
I want to make a distinction that the church and religion as a whole was a net negative for me in that experience. But I also don't want to say that there weren't certain people within the church that did help me, especially, people I grew up with. I am not going to say that there were a net negative in that whole experience, but I think that a lot of things were said to me through the lens of religion that definitely are things that I still struggle with to this day. My mom, she died of cancer. There was a period of time where we knew she was terminal, and multiple people in church saying, God is the ultimate healer, you just have to keep praying, was not helpful. Having somebody tell you God is the ultimate healer and then she dies anyway. So did God just decide not to heal my mom for funsies? I don't know. So I understand that people were trying to be comforting, and I don't necessarily fault them. I don't think they were being malicious in any way. But it almost feels like it's just a cop-out way to interact with somebody who's going through something. It doesn't feel like you're actually trying to help me at all. It just feels like, oh, I told them I'm praying for you, which is nice, but doesn't really do anything to help me. What would have actually been helpful would be just offering to help. At that point, the last summer that my mom was alive, I was working part-time, and then on the days I wasn't working, I was at home taking care of her. So, even just being like, hey, I'm free this day. I can come by and watch mom while you're at work. Practical things. I understand that if someone's belief system is that talking to God and prayer is helpful, I'm not going to begrudge anybody that. But people have to understand that just telling someone that you're praying for them, especially a person that is either struggling with God or questioning or anything like that, it just feels like empty words. You're patting yourself on the back, basically.
One of the patterns that I've seen, especially with trauma and grief, is it's almost like people are just trying to end the discomfort more than anything. And they have like religious phrases to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at like what's behind it, it's like, well, are you actually invested in my life? Do you have anything of yourself that you're willing to give to help? Anything beyond just like, I'm going to throw this like cliche phrase at you. And I think that's some of the real breakdown where it's like, well, what are you actually doing?
Mm-hmm.
So this kind of brings us to one of the biggest beefs that I have with Christianity. And that is just that we separate our own actions from what we're reading about and who we're reading about. And so when we start separating those things where it's just like, God loves you, God will take care of you, God will heal. It's like, well, what about you? Like you, the individual person, have some responsibility and choice in how you interact with people. And once you start just outsourcing it all to God, it really makes this almost like it feels like a movie set mentality where like nothing is actually deeper than surface level. And I think that's somewhat of what's happened to Christianity, is just kind of this flimsy facade of something without a whole lot of depth behind it sometimes. You know, as we're talking now, a decade or so ago, how does your relationship with the church evolve from there?
To be 100% honest with you, it's kind of dead at this point. You know, I used to be that girl that was always singing up front in church service. I would do special musics. I was involved. And then kind of slowly over the years, they ask me up front less and less because my appearance starts to change. It's funny to me because I know myself and I know that in the time where I was super active in the church, I wouldn't say that I was fully in it as far as, you know, my belief in God and believing in what I was doing. I would say the majority of it was just, you know, this is what my life is and I'm comfortable here. And in that aspect, I haven't really changed. The only thing that has changed is how I look outwardly. So that was something that I kind of struggled with a lot because I'm still the same person. I just started wearing jewelry and I cut my hair short. And then all of a sudden, I'm treated differently around the people that I've known my whole life, which is tough because on one hand, I know that it really hurts my dad to know that I'm not going to church anymore. But on the other hand, I don't feel like there's any reason for me to be doing something that I don't actually believe in anymore. It's a weird balancing act. I go sometimes with my dad just because I know it makes him feel happy to see me there, but I don't really have any connection with it myself personally anymore. It makes me feel like the church is really just for non-believers to convert into. It's not really made for people to stay. There's just no real effort in retention from the church, it feels like. The effort is bringing in new people, but there's no effort in keeping the ones that we already have, especially the younger people. There's no change to kind of embrace the younger generations. And it's not to say that every church needs to become this super liberal church, but times have changed even outside of that. Just the way that church services are run, what's being spoken about. I mean, we're in a different age. There are ways to grab what's in the Bible and make it apply to us now and not be kind of the same regurgitation of, you know, end times are coming, Revelation, the statue, the dragons, the mark of the beast, all of that. It just feels like kind of fear-mongery, and it feels like church kind of just ends up being fire insurance in case God is real, so you go to heaven instead of hell. And that's not helpful for this younger generation because we're kind of living in a world where everything is imploding already. So adding more fear when you go to church is not necessarily helpful.
Yeah. So what's the alternative? If you could start from scratch, you could write down on a whiteboard and get it all to come true. Even if you didn't go back to church, what's the Christianity that you would imagine?
I would imagine a Christianity that's more focused on fostering personal relationships with God versus the church institution, the religion of it all. Especially since I was raised in Adventism, everything felt like a ritual. You know, Friday night vespers, Saturday church, Saturday evening vespers, Hispanics, we love to do that. Wednesday church. It just felt like routine. It just felt like this is what life is. At least in my experience, there wasn't much room for teaching someone how to create their own relationship with God.
And especially if you start questioning, that's like seen as dangerous, right? Because that's the thing that leads you to not going to church anymore. And that might be true, but maybe it's a symptom of a deeper issue. And maybe that issue is that we don't actually understand why we believe what we believe. We just do it.
Yeah.
It's so weird because I look at church and what I think it's supposed to be. And it's like, okay, so there was a day where you don't have TV, you don't have radio, you don't have like all these gathering places necessarily, and a lot of people aren't literate. So you go to a place to be taught how the world works. You go to a place to find other families and for your kids to play together. And you start seeing those things fall away. Okay, well, if I need a sermon, I don't have to go to a church building ever. And I don't have to go on a particular day. I can find a sermon wherever I want. You know, I can practice the traditions. I can have an active prayer life. I can study the Bible. Why does church exist? And the answer that I've come to is community, right? It's the one place where you can have physical community across races, generations, in theory. Uh, and yet, so often, that's the one thing that's so underdeveloped. And so it's just heavily programmed and very little time for community. I was actually at a church where they were dismissing people and telling them not to stick around and talk afterward. And so it was just like, wow, that one thing that you have left, the community aspect, you're cutting short.
Mm.
One thing I'll say about our generation and younger is that we do very few things out of obligation. We need to know the reason. What's the purpose for this? Why do I come here? I need to know why we believe this. And it's not just as simple as saying, well, look, the Bible says that. It's like, well, why does it say that? Who wrote that? Why did they write that?
Mm-hmm.
Who were they writing that to? Is this poetry that you're quoting at me? Or is this a letter? Or is this, direct from God's mouth? And so we have all just this whole world of complication. And that's true even outside of religion. When we look at work, when we look at politics, even entertainment, it's just everything is kind of analyzed in a million pieces. And when you can't ask questions, it's like, well, it's probably not that strong of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm sitting in a church and they're talking about young people, when there are very few young people there, a lot of times I'm like the only person under probably 50 or older. And when I hear it described, it's like we disappeared. It's like we don't exist anymore, right? It's just like, well, they're not here with us, so therefore who knows where they are. But when you look at where we're going, it's very interesting to me that so many of us are kind of ending up in this place where it's not like another organization is claiming us. It's not like another organized religion is like just so compelling to us that we're being pulled out of the church. It's just like there's not enough here to make sense of my world.
Mm-hmm.
And there's not enough people who even understand their own faith to be able to ask questions about how messy my life is.
It's not even just about people understanding their own faith. There's no effort to understand the person as a person. So I'm not going to get anything from you spiritually if I don't feel like you care about who I am as a person. You don't know anything about me. You barely remember my name. I'm not going to figure out my eternal life status from a person who, if they've seen my face multiple times and they still have to think, what's their name again? There has to be a way to communicate with people and embrace people in a way where they feel like you want them to be there and you're not just another number to be like, got another one for Jesus. Now on to the next.
Yeah. What would success look like when you think about people of any faith or worldview where you lean in instead of lean out? What are the things that make you lean in?
I have the biggest respect for people where you can tell that they truly believe in what they're doing. And not just in what they're saying, but in the way that they're living their life, in the way that they treat others. Someone who's welcoming and doesn't feel like they're othering you. There are many times now where I'll walk into my old church and I feel like the black sheep. Even though my life doesn't really look that much different than it did when I was going to church. I just, don't go to church.
Where do you find yourself? Like when you've been kind of told what to believe for a long, long time and kind of pushed through the rituals and everything. And then you get out where you get the chance to finally make your own decisions, to kind of set up your life in a way that you would want. How did you think about your worldview and belief system? And what has that looked like since?
I feel like growing up with religion, I was kind of told that everybody is inherently bad, essentially. And I didn't realize how much that colored my worldview until I kind of started deconstructing that in the last year. I don't believe that every person is inherently bad anymore. And that is something that really blew up my worldview, to be completely honest. Not to get into capitalism, but I feel like a big part of the reason why America, we're kind of just stuck in this capitalist mindset is because everybody has the idea that people are inherently selfish and evil and bad. So there's no way that we could ever get to something of a more communal living where everybody is helping each other because people are just inherently selfish. And I don't believe that anymore. And I feel like it's a cop out. And it really just feels like an excuse to not make any positive changes, especially coming from a immigrant background, not white person. Dominican Republic was colonized and Christianity was forced upon us. So there's also the question of why is the one true religion the one that my people was forced to adopt to survive?
Yeah. And you look at the role of the people bringing it. Are they representatives of Jesus?
No.
It's a pretty tough sell, right?
Yeah. Before colonization in the US, they did have communal living. People took care of each other. It wasn't just each man for himself. So I don't believe this narrative anymore that everybody is just inherently bad and selfish, because there has been a time in the past when, quote unquote, humanity was less civilized where that's what they were doing.
Even Christianity. If you go back to the book of Acts, it says that no one wanted for anything, that everybody's needs, somebody else was looking out for them. It was communal living. They learned how to eat together. They learned how to do life together. And they were seen as these very weird people because they're always in each other's houses all the time. they're like, what is this cult, right? That's the early Christian church. And yet today, what we have looks completely different than what that original thing was. And I wonder if we looked back and were able to use that model a little more, it almost might look like a completely different religion than what we have today, even with the same name. But I wonder how much better it would be, not just for people who kind of ascribe to it, but for the world around them. So one of the things that I think about a lot as we were putting together this show is not just about like, how do we get people to come back to church, but how do we change what a Christian presence is like in the world? So the truth is that for way longer than any of us are going to be alive, there will be people who think this is the truth, whether they're right or not. There are going to be people who don't think that. So the reality is that you're going to have a group of Christians, and what do we do with them? What are some things that we could do differently, even if we still do hold on to that faith in how we relate to other people?
I think the biggest thing is just treat people like normal human beings, which I know is a radical thing to say. But thinking about the people in church that I'm still close with and I still regard well and love are the people that throughout all my life, when I was still in the church and when I'm not, have just treated me like myself. Even when I go back to visit, there are certain people I know that aren't going to judge me. They're just going to say, "Hi, Krystal." They're going to ask about, what I've been up to. Versus other people who I feel like I show up and it just feels like they're treating me like an excuse to proselytize. I don't know how else to say it. Which is especially frustrating because I'm a person who was raised in the church. I know all about it. So it's not helpful to me for someone to be like, "Hey, Krystal, come to this camp meeting. We're going to be talking about Revelation." I already know about all of that. And I've chose not to be in church. So that's not really going to help. They don't know how to treat you when you leave the church, and that just pushes you further away. I've had more than one person sell me in so many words that I need to get right with God, otherwise I will not be seeing my mom again. Which just feels like emotional blackmail. And I feel like if my only motivation to quote unquote believe in God is in the off chance that I might see my mom in heaven again, then it's not going to be real. And if that God is real, he's not going to want me there because he's going to know I just want to see my mom. Before trying to foster somebody's spirituality, you need to work on fostering friendship first. Somebody's not going to want to open up to you about their struggles with religion if they don't even think that they could tell you, oh my goodness, I had a terrible week last week. Let me tell you about it. Just being a part of someone's life, being a part of their community, I think goes way further than, hey, come join this Bible study. I think you'd like it kind of thing. Because, I mean, people already have so many worries outside of religion. Just doing the inviting people to church or inviting someone to Bible study or, those kind of things, it just feels like you're giving someone additional homework instead of trying to become a part of their life. It's more organic to me to have somebody who is in my life who I feel comfortable with, who I'm friends with, to then kind of see how they live their life and then want to maybe pursue that versus, hey, join my Bible study. Hey, here's a Bible. Here's a pamphlet. Read The Great Controversy. Some of my closest friends right now are still very much Adventist. They go to church every weekend. They're very fully committed to God. And I really respect that about them. And I respect the fact that they actually, practice what they preach. And we're able to still have a great friendship because they see me as a human being and not as someone they need to convert.
Yeah. If we could learn one skill, it's like passive teaching instead of active teaching. We're told, like, go tell people this Bible verse, go make them read this book, go get them involved in this program, go sign them up for school or summer camp or whatever it is. And passive teaching is the most under-recognized form of witnessing, I think. When people watch how you live your life, I can't tell you how many people have thought, like, wow, this is such a cool person. And we go out for lunch and the way they treat somebody at a restaurant is atrocious. And I'm like, I don't care what you say now.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever you try to talk to me about morality, whenever you try to give me advice in life, anything, I saw how you treated somebody who had less power than you, and I do not trust your opinion anymore. And I think that's what happens so often with Christians is that you're outsourcing all of that into like these texts and words and programs. But when people look at you, the individual person, and how you do things, are they getting a compelling vision of that God that you're trying to portray? Because if not, it's like taking advice from somebody who's been bankrupt 3 times. Like, I won't go to them for financial advice. I'm sorry, probably have good opinions on other things, but it's like if you're spiritually bankrupt, then you're not the person that I'm listening to for spiritual matters either. And especially in this time where there's a real reckoning with social issues, there's a real reckoning with institutional abuse, there's a real reckoning with basically becoming like religious salesmen instead of involved community members and friends and family. This is the time where we have to really live out what we're saying in the most compelling possible way and in the kindest, most humble way. And to recognize that that person, it's not just your job to teach them something, it's your job to learn from them. Do you think that there's an opportunity for the older generation to change their mind? Do you think that there's ever going to be a day where they're like, hey, there's a real separation happening between me and my kids, and I see it in my friend's family and their friend's family and their friend's family? What do you think it would take for some of that kind of rift to start healing?
First and foremost, it takes a level of self-awareness that most people don't have. It takes introspection. A lot of people, their first instinct is to try to figure out what's wrong with the other person to try to fix the problem when they're not realizing that maybe that the reason their child is doing certain things is because of how you raise them. It's kind of an obvious cliche, but the tighter you hold on to someone, the more they're going to want to break free. And I think that there are a lot of people in church who haven't realized how to balance that well enough yet. I understand that on one hand, you want to protect the younger generation, your kids, but there comes to a point where they just see you as an authority figure instead of somebody they can confide in. And that is what is really, truly dangerous.